Mais merci beaucoup pour l'invitation et j'espère que vous avez passé une bonne journée jusqu'à date et pas trop fatigué. Mais voilà, et moi donc je vais parler un petit peu sur la spéculation et improbabilité, mais je vais continuer en anglais. Mais c'est-à-dire que il y aura des questions après en français, il y a pas de souci. Je vais faire mon mieux pour répondre. Et
Et
voilà,
peut-être,
donc je vais essayer
Patricia,
de partager.
excusez-moi,
Comment?
peut-être que Laurane peut vous présenter brièvement?
Ah, pardon,
Oui,
pardon, excusez.
si vous voulez. Voilà, je lui passe le micro. Mais voilà.
And I will be starting the presentation in English then. Uh, well, I hope you see us well. Thanks for being here. I hope you had a great day too. Very briefly, because we're not here to hear me talk about you, but rather hear you. So you said that you were going to talk about speculation. We invited you both for well, the subject in general about narrative speculation and this article that you published in the book Accelerate in 2014 that was called Reorientate, Eccentricate, Speculate, Fictionalize, Geometricize, Commonize, Abstractify, 7 presentation for accelerationism. And this same year you were part of a group that worked under the name Laboria Cubonics. That published the influential Xenofeminist Manifesto, and there was a sentence in I think it's in the article that I thought was interesting concerning speculative narration. That was, it is about directing existing energies as in yet inexistent directions. So, well, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction. Sorry that I jumped in there like that. It's always hard to read the social signals online. So I'm going to share my screen. So somebody should, if someone could allow me to have a hosting privilege so that I can share my screen, that would be great. I mean, I can talk while we wait to get that working. Just give me a little sign because I know we're behind schedule. But basically, I'm going to be introducing, kind of dividing my talk into 2 points. So this should, now you see the full screen, yes?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, so yeah, great. So I'm going to be sort of dividing the talk, speculation and improbability, into 2 parts. The first part is, as was just said, give a bit of context to respond to the context that prompted this invitation, which was based on some texts that were written, like 7 years ago, some time ago. So hopefully I've done my work and there's been some updates. And so I'm going to focus more time on the second part, which I think is about exploring some of the assumptions in the problem spaces that were, I think, that I was, ascribing to or responding to in both the critique from the Accelerationist Manifesto and the Xenofeminist Manifesto, and see how those can be reworked in our present, and if there's time for the re-understanding function of art. So as it was mentioned, this context is based on these kind of 2, like I said, contributions from a few years ago, response to the Accelerationist Manifesto that was written in 2013, and then this manifesto written as Laboria Cubonics, so a collective, in 2015. And the response to the manifesto sort of departed from doubts about this very name, the term acceleration, which to me never seemed, appropriate or befitting the proposals behind constructing a counter hegemony via the sort of reappropriation of technologies and infrastructure, and of course reawakening the claims on the reorganization of labor. And it seems to me that from the perspective of today, it seems pretty clear that no matter how many robust counter explanations about the concept accelerate, it's become pretty synonymous with let's rapidly take down everything and make it worse and induce total system collapse. No matter how many, no matter even if we put this left acceleration in front of it. So basically, it seems to be that no matter how many essays that came out to add nuance and clarification, that was the claims behind the manifesto were not, in fact, about tearing everything down and making everything terrible. I think its caricaturized form just became kind of solidified with this naive celebration of kind of a nihilistic drive. And it actually, I think, does a disservice to the content of that manifesto, whether you agree with it or not, which was always about trying to construct a counter-hegemony. And it's quite anti-doomism, in fact. So I think from the get-go that term was wrong, and I'm glad to see it was pretty much dropped, I think, even when the authors of that manifesto wrote something more substantial in this book form that came out afterwards, Inventing the Future. I think it's only mentioned a couple of times in that book. So that's kind of what provided the backdrop for the writing of the Xenofeminist Manifesto. And it was, I think both manifestos were broadly sympathetic or in response to the shared undertones of Mark Fisher in terms of framing political activity in terms of being, motivated by a constructive ethos or by the creation of desire rather than being driven by fear or nihilism, indeed. And of course, we were also extremely critical of the Accelerationist Manifesto, even while having these sympathies, of course. Because of its omission of, anything to do with feminism or concerns about gender, which we thought was an appropriate vehicle through which to address such constructive counter-hegemonic claims. So it was written as Laboria Cubonics, which were composed of six women who wrote it. And our name is basically an anagram of the Nicolas Bourbaki group of largely French mathematicians when it was originated, who stood for a high degree of mathematical abstraction and genericity in the field, and they used this alias to publish such papers under. So we moved around the letters and came up with Nicolas with Laboria Cubonics, and it was a kind of implicit endorsement of the need to grapple with abstraction in order to find ways to kind of escape this muck of immediacy. So just to give the text itself is quite short. It's a typical manifesto, but the main point I would say is that the xenofeminism, so I'm going to call it XF, just because it's a mouthful otherwise. So XF argues for a feminism that is equipped to construct orientation within an entangled planetary complex reality that we find ourselves in. And so it's in this way that it's also bound to making claims on enjoining feminism and this kind of movement of enjoining or the kind of plea to reason, we also were framing through this vehicle of alienation. Therefore, we have this politics of alienation, which can be understood it's not like a social alienation, it's more like an epistemological type of alienation, just to be clear on that. Another main point is arguing for gender abolitionism. So this was not, about the eradication of gender, but it was about the eradication of harms posed upon people based on, the social encoding of gender marker traits in our current social structures, which prove punitive for many. And the third part, I think that was quite important, is it stands for a kind of feminism tied to anti-naturalism. So a feminism sort of adept at disentangling norms from facts. And lastly, I think too, this is giving the summary of an already short text, but it's standing for a type of universalism, right? And this was very vaguely alluded to, but it's basically the recognition, of course, that today, humanity is faced with the problem of coexistence in an environment in common, no matter how differently it is actually lived. So it requires a certain politics of scale. We weren't interested in, of course, rehearsing this sort of top-down Eurocentric form of historical universalism either, or where universalism comes to equal homogeneity, but rather, continue to work through an updating of this concept that could be understood more laterally, in order to kind of seek ways of constructing and maximizing solidarities despite all of our difference and the different sense of risks that are currently affecting different geographies, different people around the world in non-uniform ways. So maybe it's important to, whoops, I've got like people coming in. Hang on. Right. So, I think it's important to note, each of us, 6 women, we're coming from different fields. Most of us have I'd say most of us were not philosophers primarily going into this. And because of that, we each brought certain sets of expertise and fields of inquiry to the manifesto, and have since been, working on in our own way on the different sort of ramifications, right? Because a manifesto is at best a kind of clearing ground. It's very thick with declarations and a lot thinner on substantiations. So it's a kind of, we always saw it, like I said, as this clearing ground that would set up conditions for us to work in later on, and of course for anyone else who felt motivated to do so because of this text. And so that's kind of what brings me to, I guess, more the now. That was a very quick update, but it's always painful to re-look at stuff you wrote 7 years ago. And of course, a lot of things in the world have changed since that gap. We've had a pretty dramatic techno-social, epidemiological shifts since that time. And so I wanted to kind of take this occasion also within the context of this speculative narrations framework to kind of revisit, some of the sort of like major problem space I think the works or these 2 texts were responding to. And even what they assumed to be a true problem, and see that how that stands up. And I think if I had to summarize the common bond between both my contributions but also the previous Accelerationist Manifesto, was that we were, I think, pretty influenced by this idea that the future was canceled. And of course, that was on the back of the 2008 financial crisis, the sort of, blip of hope with the Occupy response, but more or less things kind of continued on as usual, or was even neoliberalism came even more ramped up as a response to those sets of crises. So if there was one assumption that you thought, okay, this is a kind of accurate ground upon which to base these ideas, the future was indeed cancelled. And so, of course, for Mark Fisher and this cancellation was not just political, but it was cultural. It was part of the unconscious. It was imaginary. And of course, he always used to use these examples of the infinite remakes as a kind of cultural artifact that evidenced this political stagnation. So we put it in, simple terms. If imagination is and I'm just kind of self-criticizing here, if imagination is what's lacking to overcome such a canceled future, then of course it seems appropriate to respond with an imperative to accelerate imagination and thus speculation. But I think that's that's not really a robust, that's not really a robust or sufficient question. So I think the more robust analysis actually forces us to ask, what lies behind this assumption, and what concept of futurity is or has been eroded, right? I think that those questions lead us into a more cosmological direction. Right. So I think for this, I'll turn to Suhail Malik, who's worked a lot with temporality and finance in particular. And I think he's been really helpful in challenging that assumption, if you want, or challenging such diagnosis that the future has been canceled. And he does this in part through looking at the reorganization of time through the power of financial operations. And he also takes into account in this particular text here how the COVID-19 pandemic has in fact carved out a future distinct from the past, that as he argues in this text, it serves as a trailer, or kind of it serves as a trailer for the transformations to come with climate collapse. So while, of course, Malik notes the emotionally compelling aspect of what he groups together as the defuturity thesis. So of course, we feel as if the future has been canceled, largely because, quote, in personal experience, precarity vitiates basic protections provided by reliable income, labor, accumulation, and support, end quote. Despite the feeling of this, he nonetheless declares it false, right? That the future has not been canceled. So structurally speaking, the proponents of the defuturity thesis, when we start to kind of really examine what is the nature, what is the concept of the futurity here that is being claimed to be canceled. So the proponents of the defuturity thesis broadly lament the lack of the command of futurity as a force for restructuring and reorienting our present. And what this does is it gestures to a distinctly, progressivist Euro-modern cosmology of temporality, where in its most extreme sort of mythological form, the future is guaranteed to be better than the past, right? So this is, of course, where we get into the problems of ancestrality and descendants within modernity, right? If the future is guaranteed to be better, there's, you don't really have to pay attention to those forces. So for Malik, it's not that the future as such has been canceled, but that the composition of the unknown state of a future present is now configured in relation to the calculation of risk of the present future, right? So here there's a really important distinction between the future present and the present future. So in the unknown state, the future present is like what the present will look like in the future. So the unknown, or perhaps the contingent, if we were following from Eliashe from the last session, versus the present future, or how the future looks from within the coordinates of the present. So in other words, we can think of this as a kind of probable future. And this, of course, is calculated from the array of knowns available to us in the given here and now. So the structuring force of risk as the future present helps explain why so many have been drawn to the actuary sciences, the reinsurance industries, and the so-called power of planning that is inherent to financial speculation, to borrow the notion from J.W. Mason in his proposition to socialize finance and the operation of derivatives in general. So what's important to take away here is in contradistinction or contra to the defuturity thesis, quote, postmodernity is not the present depletion or subtraction of futurity, but instead the surfeit of futurity to any present plot or program of action. Planned outcome, as for progressivist North Atlantic modernity, or even mere perpetuation of an internally modifying present, as for contemporaneity, end quote. So again, here to keep in mind, what Malik is suggesting is that the future hasn't not been canceled. We actually have a surplus of futurity, but it's manifesting in the form of assessment via risk. It's manifesting via risk assessment. So on a short, just to give a short detour here, I think it's of note as well to kind of look at this particularly different structure of time from this progressivist past to present to future mode that most of us are familiar with, because it tends to adhere to human experience of time from birth to death. But it's one that Elena Esposito has been identifying as retrospective causation. So for her, this is the kind of defining temporality of financial capitalism, where the future comes before the present, right? It precedes the present. So this is in distinction to, say, classical capitalism, where sacrifices are made in the here and now to increase future returns, whereas now anticipated money is spent in the present in order to actualize itself in the perspective of future gains. So I think what we're seeing here now, what is quite interesting to think about, especially with relation to like trying to understand causality, is this different temporal order that is at work within finance. That is, I think, only one, it's one angle of the way that our cosmological relationship to temporality is shifting, because we've also got the different scales and laminations of temporality going on within the biosphere and planetary concerns as well. So the restructuring of temporality that is indexed by financial operations and their material consequences, and this surplus of futurity at work here, in kind of moving against this pull of the defuturity thesis, I think it mirrors, and I'll admit it's a little bit of a surface reading. Aris, I didn't have time to have such an in-depth reading, but very, very interested in your book, and I think there's some interesting correspondences here in your speculative communities, and insofar as the way that we would also portray this lack of this kind of cancellation of the futurity as consequences of a lack of imagination. I think when you map your shift from Homo economicus to Homo speculans, you're actually potentially indexing a similar tendency to Suhail Malik in the way that it would be like a surplus of imagination at work here. I'm putting some ideas out for potential future discussion, but when I was reading this, it also made me wonder as well, as if we are seeing this kind of, if what we're seeing in this rather nihilistic turn within this kind of neo-fascist political moment, if it's also not perhaps an unconscious mimicry of the performance of value creation through volatility in finance that's becoming a kind of model for doing politics as well. So I'll put that on the table. It was more of a random thought after having engaged a little bit with your work. So I think the broad takeaway though is that these kind of reassessments on the reordering of time, as well as the assumed cancellation of futurity and the so-called lack of imagination in the present, they prompt important reconfiguration of our problem space when it comes to addressing, realizable techno-social betterment. So these perhaps counterintuitive assessments, I think, ought to give us pause in the wake of the boom of futurity studies, as well as the proliferation of speculation in art, design, and architecture fields. Like that's more my area of work, that often champion a kind of naive celebration of imagination as a remedy against doomism and the pervasive hopelessness vis-a-vis wicked problems. And I'm not like dismissing these fields, but they do make me wonder, what is the model of futurity? What is the nature of the temporality of futurity that they are actually grappling with in in their fields and applying their disciplinary knowledges within that framework. So besides these important reassessments, we can also note that concepts of futurity as such are a critical consequence of a particular episteme, Pace Foucault, that basically serves as a ground of positive, a ground of self-reference that guides the logic of historical epochs, right? So when I say a positive ground of self-reference, I don't mean positive in the moral or ethical sense. I just mean like you're affirming it. So what I'm suggesting is that if we are mourning the cancellation, la deuil, right? Mourning the cancellation of futurity within a linear, progressivist, temporal understanding, we're implicitly, likely inadvertently, but implicitly mourning a picture of futurity that's endemic to long Euromodernity. So Euromodernity, as defined by Lewis Gordon, is not reducible to European people, but embodies a historical worldview promoting the idea that the only way to legitimately belong to the present, and as a consequence to the future, is to be or become European. So is this really a concept of futurity that we want to be mourning? I think that's a clear no. So if we speak of speculating on futurity, which model of futurity are we basing that orientation on? And conversely, if our concepts of futurity are undergoing this kind of remodeling, in part urged on by the way technologies force us to, that sort of interaction with technologies is forcing us to kind of revisit certain biases, certain assumptions. How does that impact the way we reason interventions in a world? So I think what all of this sort of gestures to are the cosmological undercurrents that frame our concepts and thus our orientations to futurity, and more broadly to temporal orders as well. So if every historical world is governed by a particular episteme for general orientation, every historical world also comes with its specific temporal and thus futural conceptions, right? So the simple argument is the futurity we may be mourning, or that is being mourned in this cancellation of futurity, is the futurity belonging to modernity, and that doesn't and to not have that mode of futurity anymore does not mean that it's doom, right? It could be an opportunity to rethink what that concept even means, especially when we're speaking about planetary dimensions of coexistence today. So just to be clear, when I use the term world, it's to refer to practices of concrete like inhabitation and how they are cosmologically oriented. So a world is again a concrete site for activity that is shaped by particular worldviews, concepts, protocols, modes of orientation, recognition, as well as the organization of knowledge. So the configuration, this is how we can get into, right? So we say, when some of you are familiar with the end of world, the end of a world thesis, again, that doesn't have a doomism connotation. It could just be the end of a historical world in this way. So the configuration of worlds is a creation of a certain framing in relationship to reality, creating a sort of perspective on the contents and the ways in which you relate to other, including non-humans. Way when we connect speculation to world making, it's not reducible to the invention of new gadgets, but about intervening in the very frameworks that coordinate our relationship to reality, the way we understand ourselves, like human self-understanding, and practices of coexistence. So I think now I just kind of want to move into part two, if there's time, to just sort of look through, try to think through these ramifications. So that was a bit of an analysis of like where that underlying assumption was perhaps blocking, that underlying assumption of that the future had been canceled had been blocking or limiting how we may approach what the notion of speculation is. So for this, I'll turn to the work of Sylvia Wynter, who also kind of works at this cosmological dimension. And it's precisely this human self-conception that serves as a primary frame of reference for determining the configuration of worlds. And she goes so far as to say that there can be no, paradigmatic historical change without a corresponding transformation in the genre of being human. So for Wynter, the concept of the human serves as this kind of virtual model through which to relate to reality, right? Not unlike Aris's notion of these kind of Homo economicus being an archetypal figure, right? It's not an actual person, it's an archetype. And Wynter names these idealizations as genres of being human, and they basically serve as a kind of framework for organizing practices and norms of social life, functioning like a template for so-called proper behaviors, activities, motivations, behaviors, and so on. And moreover, it's an idealization that's rehearsed through social and economic structures that incentivize adaptation to this human genre concept that belongs to that particular historical period. So this self-reproducing feedback loop effectively naturalizes a specific concept of being human, right? That archetype, while excluding all beings and entities that are not in compliance with it. And this human concept is basically internalized as a kind of law-likely natural fact that's often unconsciously practiced, and it shapes both knowledge claims and organizations of social life that, that confirm the veracity of that archetypal figure. So it's due to the force of these habituating frames of reference, right? Referencing that human. It's almost like that archetypal figure is almost like the gravitational kernel driving a historical solar system, if you want. That, Wynter highlight, it's because of these habituating frames of reference that govern a particular era of history, obviously regionally specific as well. Wynter highlights, an important distinction between the production of adaptive truths that confirm the legitimacy of this existing referential figure versus truths in general. And because of this tendency towards adaptive truths, Wynter also, addresses the roles that intellectuals play in rehearsing and perpetuating these frames of reference that structure the conditions of possibility or impossibility, inclusion and exclusion of a particular era. So I think obviously us artists and designers and philosophers aren't immune to such assumptions. And so I think it's continually useful to be asking ourselves if some of the conclusions or ideas we have are not possibly falling into that adaptive truth category as well, merely rehearsing this human genre concept. So it's due to this problem of adaptive truths that Wynter has identified and the way it serves to foreclose upon the capacity to speculate in substantially non-adaptive ways that she turns to Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific paradigm shifts. So a paradigm can be understood as the cultivation and discursive conditioning of historical milieu that enables certain general pathways while it disables others. Furthermore, discoveries and inventions within that particular configuration are bracketed as belonging to a certain period. So the important thing is here is like the sort of brief summary here, of course, is that people will work very hard to preserve the paradigm despite contrary evidence, but nonetheless they eventually do change at some problem. But I think that there's two sort of key insights related to hold on to with regards to thinking speculation. And one is the connection to the defining of problems or the problem spaces that are going to drive certain methodologies, right? And I think that I was trying to sort of exemplify that by showing you my own error in defining a problem space that wasn't the problem as such, right? So that's a key angle of thinking when it comes to imagining speculation in a mode of non-adaptation. And the second is what we can think of as a speculative disposition in a way. So it's an openness to forming new commitments based on the informational exposure brought about by new problems and methods. So I can quickly wrap up. Would that be good? To like 5 minutes? Is that good? Good. Okay.
Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Great. So I think at this point it's worth emphasizing this idea of non-adaptation in relation to world making, and we can see that that by rehearsing those problems, we can only they can only be witnessed from the vantage point of the present future of risk of historical world paradigms, and these, of course, yield only adaptive truths, right? So this is like where we're getting into the question of like probability based on almost like the problem of induction, the problem of seeing the future only in the model of a kind of risk sort of calculation. So non-adaptation, on the other hand, highlights the plasticity of the human as a history-making creature, what Winter calls homo narrans, which is obviously an interesting figure in the context of this particular conference focusing on speculative narration, right? That she's using that term to describe us as both biological and metabiological creatures, right? We create environments, we create stories that manifest in the world that then imprint upon us at the kind of artifactual mind level. And so this kind of non-adaptation aims the conceptual narrative and material refusal of a certain worldly configuration. And it's a move that also implies a collective agency to problematize the apparent givenness of what it means to be human in all of our myriad relationships. So just to kind of close out maybe with, I want to maybe bring in this one term that I think will be important to the discussion today. And it's a term that I want to emphasize is realizability. In relation to the problem of idealism that is sort of endemic to speculation with regards to world making, keeping in mind, of course, the fatal hubris of disembedded humans in deploying sheer imagination as a transformative force alone, as if reality is subordinate purely to human whims. So as the theorist A.A. Cavilla notes, realizability offers a materialist conception of truth. So it's almost like a kind of, in a computational form, this would be like a program that can execute certain functions. Realizability pertains to manners of doing. So while that delusional narrations may be possible at a purely imaginative level, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but they're not realizable at the level of practice. And what I'm sort of hinting at here is a problem that I see very often in my field, that again, that imagination or speculation is willy-nilly, it can be trivial. So what are ways of thinking speculation in relationship to materials that are also with non-trivial consequences? And that's what I'm hoping to sort of make clear, or as a procedure, imagine through this idea of realizability. That, or we fall into like the possibility idealism, right? Like we can just say the possible, the possible. So with that in mind, I think it's useful to repeat a question posed by Ray Brassier not so long ago, because it implicitly concerns speculation and so he asked, how do you liberate possibility from the prison of actuality without resorting to absolute transcendence? So to rephrase the dilemma another way, how do we invent possibility that isn't readily at hand or intelligible to us from within a given life world and its corresponding referential frameworks without resorting to some kind of godlike agent who can manipulatively create anything without material limitation? So inherent to this problem is the friction between the artificial plasticity of human-made historical worlds, right, homo narrans, and reality that operates independently from human perception and manipulation, even if affected and modified by it. And so at the crux of Brassier's question is how to learn to witness a realizable possibility that may be hidden or obfuscated by our existing habits of thought, reinforced as they are through this force of adaptation to a given, epistemic normative order. So the problem of witnessing the existence of the realizable possibility of other worlds from within a given world that obscures the sensitivity to this possibility is a problem tied to thinking from without the enclosure of the given encoded world. So it's something that we can start to call a sort of like normalized or anticipated possibility in distinction to possibility as such. And so this is where I would just end with this note that obviously we're gesturing here to the distinction between probable possibility and the improbable. So perhaps that's enough to bring us into discussion. I don't want to take up too much more time. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I wonder if we have the discussion now, or if we have Aris presenting now, and then we have a common discussion for both, as you talked about Aris's book and Homo Speculans and Homo Narrans as well. I believe maybe it's better to have Aris's view so that the discussion has both perspectives. Yeah.
I think there are some nice common threads.
Yeah. So maybe let's do this. And so, Aris, so you have the PowerPoint on my computer. So I'm going to yes, it's on my desktop. Okay. Presentation. Okay. And so I'm going to share the screen as well for Patricia. Yes. Oh, yes. And Patricia, you need to put me as a host of the discussion now, because I gave you the host, so now I can share. Yeah. Do you manage to do it on the Zoom to put me as a host of the session, so that I share my screen, because I gave you the host so that you share.
Oh, are you talking to me?
Yes, you
Oh,
should.
sorry.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm sorry. What do you want me to do? You want me to like unhost myself? What?
Yes, or give me, make me the host.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where do I do
Oh
that?
no, I can do it. No, actually, I can do it. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, it's done. Okay. So now you should see the PowerPoint of Aris, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Perfect. Okay. Great.
Okay, and I think I fixed the camera so you can see me as well, hopefully.
Great. Yeah. Totally.
Okay, great. So, yeah, so thanks for the invitation, Theo, and it's really a pleasure to be here. It's really...
Maybe if Citton will... Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Or I can introduce you.
Sure.
Yeah. So Aris Komporozos-Athanasiou is a professor of sociology at University College London, and he has published recently Speculative Communities, Living with Uncertainty in a Financialized World, at the University of Chicago Press. And I have seen you presenting the book in London and in Cologne and in many other places, and it's a great read, and that intersects a lot with what we've been saying earlier in the day. And also Yves Citton will have many things to develop about the book, and myself, I have also many things to say. And so the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind words about the work. And yeah, it's like I was saying, it's lovely to be here. And I think it's, I know you and I have had the chance to interact a fair amount. I mean, I don't envy that you have to sit through yet another presentation here. I've tried to tweak it a little bit, so hopefully not all repetitive. But yeah, it's also nice to be in conversation with Patricia, whose work I've been following for some time now, but we've actually never met. And it's actually, yeah, I think it's a really nice opportunity to explore this shared ground that I think exists between our work. So, speculative communities. I think what I can want to start with is yeah, maybe I can actually bring this a bit closer. Is that okay? Oh, yeah, right. So Yeah, I'll do this. Okay. There's multiple technologies operating here, so the book essentially is attempting to answer a series of provocative questions. So these are some kind of questions that I've put up on this slide, questions that guided my work on this book. And these, intuitively, I can summarize them in one, perhaps, which is what can we learn from this confusing, disorienting, highly complex, complexified, and spectacular world of finance, the world of financial markets? How can we use that world as a lens through which to understand a series of social and political phenomena of contemporary time? And so what I try to do in the book is draw a series of parallels between that volatile and uncertain world of markets, the ways in which markets respond to that volatility and uncertainty on the one hand, and the ways in which society at large and social and political agents, human beings, are themselves responding to uncertainty and to volatility. My claim is that they do so in increasingly similar ways as markets do. And I suppose that there is one rather provocative claim that lies at the heart of this analysis that I carry out in the book, which is that rather than the familiar narrative of critical theory that has financial markets and financialized capitalism presents them as a force of individuation, fragmentation, segmentation, depoliticization. My argument is that particularly these highly speculative types of financial capital and financial behaviors, in fact, inadvertently function to collectivize and politicize society. There is a collective aspect that is quite generative in the way in which finance imagines vis-a-vis uncertainty and volatility. So my argument is that actually rather than, and as Patricia was saying, this mourning futurity, mourning loss of the future, there is a lesson to be learned through looking at the ways in which finance produces that future. And part of that production of the future is political. And I'm interested in how we as political agents insert ourselves in that openness of the political space opened by finance. So I want to start with a short vignette from the book itself, from the final chapter of the book, and I'm going to read this is part of the political, where I'm trying to draw out the political implications of that logic of speculation that interests me in the book. So in June 2020, and amid the first wave of the coronavirus pandemic, during a global wave of Black Lives Matter protests, a string of unusual stories made headlines. On June 5th, news media reported that BLM supporters had launched a coordinated cyber sabotage against the social media accounts of the Dallas Police Department. On the same day, the department had asked its followers to post video evidence of illegal activity during the demonstrations of during that weekend's demonstrations of Black Lives Matter to their I Watch Dallas app. The amateur saboteurs responded to that call by posting a relentless barrage of fan cams, which is a TikTok parlance for video and photo compilations of a K-pop idol or group, gaming clips and anime GIFs, thus overloading the app, the police app, and forcing the department to announce that it was temporarily removing it due to technical difficulties. And sorry, I should be showing this slide here. On the same day as this news broke, Newsweek magazine ran a story about a separate wave of K-pop fan cam attacks on social media accounts that were associated with far-right conspiracy theorist movement, the QAnon movement. In the days that followed, a number of conservative and neo-fascist hashtags were also targeted, including hashtag All Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, and so on, all deploying the same method. An onslaught of randomly selected, willfully disorienting, off-message images and videos of K-pop bands. The aim of these attacks was not to subvert Trump supporters and their efforts to disseminate information. Sorry, it was to subvert the Trump supporters and their efforts to disseminate information through social media and to organize physical meetings through the use of hashtags. The outcome was a success. The messages of Trump supporters, conspiracists, and white supremacists were almost completely drowned out within hours. So this injection of volatility in the social media spaces occupied by those right-wing supporters had the outcome of confusing them and drowning out their attempts to communicate with each other. A few days later, on June the 10th, President Trump announced his decision to host a rally for his 2020 re-election campaign in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in what would be his first major campaign event since the pandemic's outbreak. In a matter of days, a call for sabotaging the event went viral on Instagram and TikTok. Hundreds of teenagers swiftly, as we know, this is a very familiar story by now, reserved tickets for the event with the express aim of never showing up. So on June the 20th, on the day of the event, when Trump took the stage, the arena looked spectacularly empty. Speculation on television networks and social media was rife, and public debate soon turned to photoshopped crowds and other image tampering, as well as claims of alternative facts. Sorry, I skipped a part here. No, so what I wanted to say is that much to the surprise of the Trump campaign, the media, and all those watching, it soon transpired that the majority of tickets had been reserved by TikTok saboteurs. How had that been possible? The Tulsa fiasco is reminiscent of another much debated event involving a controversy around the presence of crowds and the blurred line between reality and fiction. Trump's 2016 inauguration ceremony. How large was the crowd that gathered on the US Capitol's West Lawn to watch the speech? Speculation on TV networks and social media was rife, and the debate turned soon to photoshopped crowds, image tampering, and claims of alternative facts. That controversy was in effect the first episode in the post-truth saga that came to mark Trump's time in office. The Atlantic magazine called it poignantly an attempt to weaponize magic. Similar media criticism was leveled at Tulsa's TikTok saboteurs that we just spoke about. The culprits behind those attacks were identified as alt TikToks, a subculture within this platform that comprises young, mostly teenager users with a strong community identity. Those old TikToks are known for even higher levels in the irreverence and obscurity of their uploaded content than those commonly circulated in the app. Their posts are seen as the true chaotic space of the platform. A popular argument that was represented, for instance, by the Washington Post's technology correspondent cautioned against this group's outlandish practices. It derided this kind of politics as an activism of online tricksters. It was the words that the article used. But even a president known for denying reality, on this occasion seemed to understand that the offensive against him was a hazy act of speculative politics. Unlike the West Lawn's photoshopped crowds, the emptiness of Tulsa Arena was indisputable, however, plain for all to see. Much like in the BLM acts I described in the beginning of this vignette, TikTokers did not use technology as a means of creating a fake reality, but deployed fakery to create real chaos. Like competent political speculators, they cared little about controlling the direction of their actions, the outcomes of those actions. Rather, they inserted themselves into the tidal movements of volatility. Their activism did not aim at revealing their target's evils. The strategy of revelation, of telling the truth that is favored by, for example, whistleblower activist and activism tradition. Rather, they sought to drown and muddle their opponents' messages. And importantly, rather than entering in an unauthorized way, invading proprietary space, the TikTokers' actions worked collectively within such platforms by gently but legally shepherding their algorithms towards their own means, towards their own aims. Considered together, these acts had a cumulative effect of disorientation that wasn't immediately perceived as such. While the Generation Z's political memes circulated openly on Instagram and TikTok's proprietary platforms, they seemed even more obscure than the alt-right's subreddits of the 2010s, the 8chan, 4chan reactionary message boards associated with the extreme right. K-poppers and TikTokers posted from authentic accounts before ultimately covering the tracts by deleting uploaded content within hours of posting it. In so doing, they were practicing the well-rehearsed routines of the short-lived Instagram story and TikTok story. The agents of the TikTok attacks are trained, and this is a point I want to emphasize, in a technological environment where contingent ambiguity and ambivalence is an ally, a natural ally, rather than an enemy when confronting uncertainty. Their acts emanate from the same spaces and technologies that we use in our modern pursuits of sociality and even intimacy. And I will come back to that point a bit later in the talk. The argument I'm making today is that these kind of acts form part of a wider phenomenon, a different way of living with uncertainty in our financialized world. They represent a dynamic, collective imagination that is expressed through speculation and defines how we engage, embrace, and even encourage and weaponize volatility. How we stake the unknown, not with the intention of controlling the future's uncertainty, but in the hope of benefiting from it. Speculation is the defining logic of our time, a consequence of increasing unpredictability and precarity. Confronted with an increasingly turbulent world, we give up on rational risks and predictable returns, and instead we place wagers on a widening range of incomputable outcomes, not only in how we approach questions of money and the economy, but also in the way we engage in politics, everyday culture, and in our social and romantic lives. And now I want to take a step back and tell us a story about speculation itself and the way in which I understand speculation in the book and in this argument I have beginning to develop here. So whether in markets and gambling or in philosophy and religion, speculation tosses the coin of uncertainty in the hope of seeing through a haze-draped future. A mirror, speculum in Latin, and a watchtower, specula, it animates a certain vision. From the leaps of scientific revolutions and technological futurity to the pursuit of dreams and mystical theologies. Searching the world for signs and portents, speculators have always sought to capture what lies ahead. Driven by such visions, they breed prophecies that tie people together into shared fates, taming the future's obscurity. Or they place high-risk wagers whose volatile yields exacerbate uncertainty further still. Speculation, I want to emphasize, in that sense, stands for both closure and openness to the unknown. Closer to the subject of today's presentation, speculation encompasses a duality that perches at the core of all financial activity. When pushed to its outermost limit, it can unleash formidable destructive forces, the stuff of frenzies and fads, manias, leading to the burst of market bubbles like with the one depicted in this slide, the 17th century Amsterdam tulip craze, or sorry, the one here is the Victorian era's railway mania. During these periods, market passions, memorably described by the Fed's totemic chairman Alan Greenspan as irrational exuberance, during such moments, passions take hold. Traders venerate ethereal values with no material reference or links to fundamentals. They take leave of reality itself. Yet, speculation is also the market's indispensable lubricant. All speculative trades, in essence, calibrate risks in order to generate yields, and in doing so, they prevent markets from overheating. Somewhat counterintuitively then, the speculation's greatest gift to markets is stability, not crisis. absorbing volatility by smoothing out price fluctuations and by generating much needed liquidity. For those in the business of trading, speculation means betting on possible future movements of asset prices, but it also involves dealing in risky assets like derivatives with the goal of providing insurance against such price movements. Speculators, in other words, both short and hedge uncertainty. As markets in the global centers of capitalism, so I want to here, I'm telling a bit of a historical, I've tried to give a historical account of speculation and of this productive function, and it's this, dialectic between openness and closure that I'm trying to describe. So I'm taking as, and in the book what I do is I go back to the origins of this highly volatile financialized markets in American capitalism of the late 19th century, with symbolized, epitomized with the foundation of the Chicago Board of Trade and the first dealing of future, the highly volatile future contracts in this formalized market for future contracts. So as markets took hold and sought to expand their insatiable financial activities over the course of the 19th century, they vied fervently for control over the power of speculation. So when the CBOT, the Chicago Board of Trade, became the world's first organized exchange for future contracts, ostensibly, the trading of futures served the hedging side of speculation's coin, the insurance against volatility for farmers whose harvest was exposed to radical and incalculable weather uncertainties. So in that way, speculators were stepping in to take on the unwanted risk at a discount, and they performed thus a social function, while farmers got security and the market remained liquid. Yet no bushels of grain were being moved because of these trades, and even actual contracts never exchanged hands inside the CBOT. So this leave from reality, this difficulty in capturing and materializing what was going on with the exchange of future contracts has baffled observers at the time. And here I'm citing a little poem that Bertolt Brecht wrote upon his visit at the Chicago and the CBOT. So specifically with regards to the fictitious dealings that were taking place, entirely unmoored from the corporeal economy. Okay, and the point I want to make here is that there was an ongoing debate at the time around whether or not the role of the speculator through these fictitious dealings was ethical, and was it really different to ordinary gambling? Advocates of the CBOT and the contract trading and their allies answer that question in the positive, that actually speculation is both ethical and different to gambling. State courts enshrined the legal right of future traders to short sell for their alleged positive effect on setting off prices in the real economy. And successive governments sanctioned the promise of even the most fictitious of trades to, quote unquote, stabilize an inherently unstable capitalism. Importantly, speculative bets made in the pit of the Chicago Board of Trade were distinguished by their advocates from the wagers that were taking place outside of those incorporated markets. So I'm talking here about the mushrooming of bucket shops, such as the one in this image. So these were informal establishments that allowed access to anyone who wanted to wager small sums on the price movements of stocks in the formal exchanges. So they were following the stock ticker, and they were placing bets outside of the main exchange. These mushroomed during the late 19th century and the early 20th century in American cities. And so speculation through those establishments was becoming a game for the many. But this was a disorganized kind of speculation that was associated typically with farmers, with people of color, with migrant urban workers, and even women at the time, groups that were not only excluded from the futures markets of Chicago, but also derided as morally repugnant. They imagined netherworld of dingy gambling houses served as a convenient scapegoat to the celestial palaces and halls of future trading. By transposing the evils of speculation to outcast lay bettors, the pit's denizens and their powerful allies were strengthening the legitimacy of the Homo economicus. They were casting Homo economicus as a noble figure, standing at the helm of American capitalism. But the speculative activities across those exchanges and the informal bucket shops had deeper affinities in that Victorian era. Speculators from all walks of life wielded a vivid imagination to navigate the opacity of staking the future. Numinous ambulation, flights from reality, were not the exclusive purview of irrational and exuberant crowds of the lay bettors I was describing. Professional financiers regularly turned to occult technologies of market prognostication, to mystifying and spiritual worlds. Their speculations, too, were meandering through the worlds of magic, superstition, tarot card reading, and astrology. Stock market's close encounter with astrology is perhaps the most telling of this enmeshment of the rationality and the irrationality in markets. Wall Street traders lined up to hit the predictions of financial astrologers like the notorious Evangeline Adams, pictured here, while mainstream financial technologies were adopting horoscopic methods that sought to map the movements of markets onto those of stars. In the dawn of financial capitalism's modern era, speculation created a world that was at once obscure and spectacular, full of stardust and bitter conflicts. A world, importantly, that was far from insulated from broader social reality. Speculators at the time were a mirror image of society rather than a deviation from it, reflecting its drive to lay wagers on the unknown in the face of radical uncertainty. This world is one that we still recognize as ours. Following a period of further financialization during the 20th century, and especially intensified in the later part of the 20th century, heralded by the appeal of the Glass-Steagall legislation and other developments that have been discussed today, I believe, this time more intensely, new technologies propelled the speculative imagination that I'm describing here even more forcefully, more pervasively, more spectacularly. In today's turbocharged financial markets, speculation is even more opaque because of the highly complex technologies on which it relies. Machine learning, algorithmically powered, super-fast trading systems whose inner workings are often indiscernible even to the traders themselves. HFT, automated trading, take place in virtual pits with data scientists and coders sitting quietly in front of rows of screens monitoring a ceaseless search for patterns through stacks of data, including predictive analysis of social media content that can inform trading decisions. Not that different to the practices of yesteryear's financial astrologists. On the most obscure end of these markets, speculators submerge themselves in dark pools, exclusive forums of block trading of securities that evade transparency requirements, where dealings appear even more detached from reality. The complexity of this kind of trading means that it is often impossible to tell whether a product like the derivative will be used to hedge an uncertain event or derive profit from it. At the same time, speculative wagers are now placed not merely on the uncertainty of the future, but also on the volatility of uncertainty itself. At Chicago's CBOE, the successor of the CBOT that I was just talking about, and America's largest modern options exchange, volatility has its own index, commonly called the VIX, or the fear index, a measure of expected price swings in the S&P options market. CBOE's virtual pit even trades volatility as an asset class with its own index futures. Yet beyond this dreamlike world of hyper-technologized finance, contemporary markets' thirst for volatility is now reminiscent of our own immersion into the gamified reality of digital media, where speculation breaks out of organized pits to become a mass spectacle. While retail trading of highly volatile assets, and I should say that I'm referring here, I was writing the book before the huge explosion of crypto trading and NFTs, as that was in its early days. So the explosion of highly volatile assets trading in the post-2008 era, meme and crypto trading platforms, decentralized finance, dApps, these provide the online bucket shops of our own times, for our own times, virtual punters. Mass shorting events like the GameStop saga that I'm sure you're all familiar with, I won't go into details, this grassroots short squeeze on the price of the iconic video game retailer, these kind of events betray a world where volatility is treated as an opportunity in a society writ large, with ordinary people sowing, cultivating, rather than averting uncertainty in order to reap profit. Following a long trail of speculators for whom the worlds of wizardry and reason were never too far apart, today's short sellers care little about untangling reality from fiction. In their augmented everyday lives, from metaverse and Web 3.0 to the halls of in-game trading of NFTs, they are drawn to strange narratives, increasingly untethered from material reality and weaved into the mainstream. Perhaps most alarmingly, the confusion sown by this radical fragmentation of our everyday experiences fans the rise of right-wing conspiracy fantasies and regressive movements like QAnon, which are rapidly moving from the fringes of political discourses to center stage. Under such conditions, speculation once again emerges as an apt and imaginative response to the chaotic volatility wrought by financialized life. Importantly, though, and I want to make this is a critical point in the book, it emerges as a collective rather than merely an individual act. The kind of speculation involved in these gamified worlds evokes a yearning for community, for imagined connectivity, a joint hedging of uncertainty. Wagers across economy and politics, from crypto bros coordinating their short sells around meme stocks to profit from destabilized prices, all the way to voters in Middle England sowing Brexit chaos in the hope of disrupting the liberal technocratic status quo, are oriented towards new solidarities and often towards confusing political alliances. Such speculations place demands on the future in ways that encompass, rather than redress, doubt, ambivalence, and cynicism. And so, as I'm coming towards the end, I want to draw out one specific example of a social digital space that I look at the book, which is very interesting in the way in which these speculative, imaginative attempts for connection manifest themselves in our day-to-day lives. So before they become political, this is part of how, this is a way to demonstrate this concept of speculative communities that I've been implying so far. And so here I'm talking about CoStar. What is CoStar? I don't know how many of you know of it. It's a very popular, particularly with a younger generation of users, the same one as the TikTokers that organize the sabotage attacks I started the talk with. So CoStar is a digital astrology app, a leader in a market that has exploded in value and in user base over the last 5 years or so. So this kind of re-emergence of astrology and its success among Gen Zers has also captivated and intrigued mainstream media, which often explain it in terms of its capacity to give us answers, the answers that we already desire, especially when there's uncertainty and crisis. We need the easy answers, right? But what if the answers we now seek is uncertainty itself? Developed by an alliance of software engineers, amateur astrologers, and literary consultants, CoStar mixes the language of algorithmically generated poetic sarcasm with a distinctive monochrome visual aesthetic. Its smart daily messages offer an irreverent darkness, instructing its users to start a cult, get off the internet, check your ego. This unusual function of astrology apps has been hailed as the new psychotherapy for Gen Zers, or as psychotherapy plus magic. The opacity of the algorithmic predictions on the app and the assorted esoteric iconography seems to offer apt representations of chaotic everyday life experiences of their users. Such predictions bear out rather than intervene in our bewildering experiences of our life, of the uncertainty of our life. So they seem to be aligning with the user's own cynical expectations for their futures. While the attraction of traditional astrology of more wholesome times seemingly lay in the comfort of its determination and prediction, its digital successors make no promises of certainty. The Neptunian fog that they produce, that they offer us, yet resonates with our moment's zeitgeist. This new generation of astrology apps offer only an inherently unknowable future. As the CoStar motto goes, astrology is fake but true. And as they continue, we now need irrationality to invade our techno-rationalists' way of living. But importantly, astrology apps now harness such representations to connect people, much in the manner of the platforms like TikTok and Instagram I started the talk with. CoStar's personal charts are increasingly social, linked in real time to the charts of users' extended networks of friends, connected through Facebook, WhatsApp, etc. This speculative kind of sociality engendered by this app is a particularly popular feature for the users, as it allows them to discover how compatible they are with each other in terms of, among other categories, emotions, symbolized by moon, intellect by Mercury, sexual desire by Mars, and idealism by Jupiter. The app deploys the same mischievous irreverence used in its messages to regularly update charts of harmony or discord amongst one's friends. My point here is this. The striking popularity of digital astrology apps reveals a shift in the function of algorithmically powered media at large, from instruments of forecasting, prediction, and risk control to vehicles of collective uncertainty and incubators of the speculative sociality of our time. While they have little in common with the astrologists of the past, such platforms are part of a rapidly expanding assemblage of technologies which mediates the way we imagine and experience contemporary finance capitalism. And a key related point I want to make, and I try to argue about in the book, is that these kind of speculative technologies, Instagram, TikTok, astrology apps, dating apps, they do not merely co-opt users by converting our lived experiences into commodified predictive data. This is a strong case that has been made, and it's true in many ways. But it's not the only thing that is going on there. They also co-produce and represent the conditions of radical uncertainty that define a speculative mode of being, of social being, what I call homo speculans. And it's the figure that Patricia mentioned there. And it's a figure that I develop in the book to distinguish specifically from the so-called homo economicus, the individualistic, rationality-driven, utility-maximizing, but also in more entrepreneurial iterations, risk-taking figure of homo economicus. Homo speculans I define as a more imaginative, a more relational, social figure. And to just give an example, rather than the Wolf of Wall Street, the kind of charming Leonardo DiCaprio of the famous novel by I think it's a Robert Harris. It's also a Robert Harris novel. What we're moving, this figure of homo speculans, is a more tragic figure, I want to point us here another reference for it is Robert Harris's The Fear Index, which is based on this mathematician, geeky and psychologically unstable guy who's deployed in this by this Swiss company to lead this a company that are crunching data, all kinds of social data in order to predict and actually manipulate social and political outcomes in order to make profits. So, coming to a close here, in the book, I'm interested in the political implications of this shift from Homo economicus to Homo speculans. Critiques of Homo economicus, even progressive critiques of Homo economicus, often set it up against an idealized Homo politicus that needs in turn to be resurrected. We need to recover this lost political agency that has been suffocated by the Homo economicus. In response, discussion often centers on a search for alternative narratives that strive to rescue a more radical political subject from the imagined figure of Homo economicus. Finance is seen in this framing as a force of fragmentation and individuation. With Homo speculans, I want to rehabilitate the role of the imagination in economic as well as in social life, a role that precedes both rationality and what can be designated as the realm of emotions, what Keynes famously called animal spirits. And a key implication of this is to challenge the reductive view of individual economic agents who are seen as irrational masses and crowds in their aggregate level, in the sum, and to foreground instead questions of community, relationality, connectivity, the ways in which our economic imaginations produce a kind of collective sense of self that can be profoundly political, even though its political manifestations today often take highly regressive forms. See the Capitol Hill insurrection, QAnon movements, and so on. How am I doing with time? Is it time to wrap up, I think? Yeah, okay. So, and to finish, I think this is probably the best. I'll stay here. So, I think this is a good link also with Patricia's final points, which point us to this question of realizability. How can we think about, in different ways, about the loss of futurity, rather in terms of the production of futurity? So think in terms of the generative ways, in more generative terms, such as those that finance itself as an arena is pointing us to. And so, perhaps just in my final few words, I want to say something about the importance of the imagination in my framing of speculative communities, and this I owe to two thinkers mainly, Cornelius Castoriadis, who of course lived and wrote in France, and Benedict Anderson, both of whom sought to rehabilitate the role of the imagination as something that is not imitative, reflective, responsive to a reality, but rather productive of a reality, okay? So our world exists around us and materially exists because we're capable of imagining it. And in imagining it is we're bringing into existence, okay? So that's a key point, and importantly, it is the outcome of shared imaginaries. Anderson famously talks about the national state, the nation state as the product of our shared imaginaries. So, if publishing novels and reading newspapers were the tools in which Benedict Anderson's national imaginary materialized, then posting stories online and scrolling through streams of social media content is how our speculative communities come to life today. Our everyday use of speculative technologies is capitalism's new vernacular. These are proprietary algorithms, image and video sharing platforms, social media, location-aware dating apps. These are the commodified tools of connectivity that animate our speculative communities. And importantly, their members are not lone narcissistic gamblers nor passive dupes of a surveillance capitalism. They're more than that, I argue. We are more active. We have more imaginative agency in how we engage with this confusing, volatile, disorienting world that we are immersed in. Okay, So as I hope to have demonstrated in this talk, these acts are our collective way of coping with the unknown, but yet it's a collective way and not an individualized way. Speculation, I want to finally just leave you with this thought as a definitive feature of contemporary life across spheres of economy and politics. It's not a phantasmatic or parasitic logic that drives the financial markets' pursuits. Not only that logic, at any rate, it is also a more productive mechanism of imagining community, of collective coping with volatility, and thus not only a symptom, as often critiques in political theory suggest, but also a structure, something more foundational and generative, and therefore something that may also contain valuable answers to the financialization of modern life. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
All right, so we'll have around 30 minutes of questions, discussions, reactions with everyone. So we have actually Yves and Laurane who have come here. So I don't know how we want to do. Maybe you want to have the first questions, Laurane and Yves, and also the objective is to let you talk with each other, Patricia and Aris. So and then we'll have questions from the audience. Laurane, you want to talk?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I don't know if this works. Okay, it does. Thank you very much for both these very dense presentations. I have to say something before I ask a question. This morning, Costa sent me a little notification that said just burst. So I don't know where that leaves us for the talk right now. The question, after hearing what both of you said, I think that something that came regularly to my mind was this notion of scale. I know that Patricia talked a lot about it. I don't know if she can hear me or not. And maybe I was wondering how you think about all the concurrential narratives that are going on at the same time. That is to say that if you think that there are several narratives that are producing and actualizing political forces both in the kind of in the instant, like in the present thing, and creating new frameworks for thinking and organizing in terms of politics. So that's what you talked about, and I think that I was also interested when Patricia said that the futurity or the vision of the future that we are losing actually is a Eurocentric one. That means that there are potentially different concurrential narratives at different scales, and how do you think that their interaction or their intrication is something that you have thought of or taken into account in your reflections? I don't know if that...
How should we do this? Do you want to take a few comments or should... Go ahead. Okay. No, thanks a lot for this, and it brings, I think, it's also again a nice way to maybe try and link between our talks the question of time, question of present and future, which you spoke about in your talk, Patricia. One point I want to make, and I don't know if that directly answers to your question, is that in the book and in my concept of speculative communities, I am quite interested in the notion of the present. It actually focuses more on the kind of present that we generate and inhabit in our attempts to respond to the uncertainty of the future. So there's something about the kind of politics that I am mapping out, and I should say this is not, my work is not prescriptive, so I'm not trying to kind of produce a kind of theory of how to do radical politics, but it's an explicit intention of the book to attempt to see at this kind of subterranean and kind of swarm-like politics that looks weird. We don't actually identify it in traditional terms, but it's already there. So my attempt with speculative communities is to look at something that is happening at the present. So my point here is that by the speculative imagination, by exercising our speculative imagination, we don't necessarily produce discernible future outcomes. We're not guided by the production of some kind of certain representation of those outcomes, but we are guided by the shared act of immersing in that kind of lack of definition, in that uncertainty, in that inherent incapacity to predict, to control the future. There is something that, and this is the notion of openness and closure that I was implying in my talk. There is something about the openness of accepting this unknowability of the future, and there is the closure we get at by the fact that this is a collective bet. It is a collective wager. So yeah, maybe I'll stop here. We can come back to this. I'll give the chance to Patricia also to.
Yeah, Patricia, do you want to say something about it, to reply?
Sure.
Also?
No, I wrote a lot of notes because I thought it was a really interesting analysis, and I completely understood that you weren't being prescriptive in this, but you're actually trying to give us a lens through which to analyze these phenomena that we may just like. I mean, I remember when that whole K-pop stand during BLM and the Trump tickets. I mean, it was like a quick laugh, but I didn't, devote to analysis. I was very happy to see you bring it up. I think my question would be, and I struggle with this a lot in my own work, so it's more to bring it out there, but I'm thinking about the way, and again, you all know much more about finance and the actual like market things better than I do, but the power differentials, right? In the sense of, I understand you were using this vehicle of speculation and finance to map it into other social processes that weren't necessarily about, they were more gamifying certain situations, but not about like actually making a gain. They weren't like going for literal money necessarily. But in terms of like the power differentials in the sense of the planning force of that speculative gesture, right? Like if enough people with enough money wager on the anticipation of something happening, there's a higher probability it will actualize. Whereas that's less so with people with less material power behind them. So I'm just wondering about if there's or are you, pardon the pun, putting the wager on the collective in order to compensate for that lack of, let's say, material or like literal money power, in order to potentially start to sway and weight? Because I think when we're speaking about futurity now in complex systems, the best we can do is talk about weighting and swaying, and it's not like planning, like this is going to happen, right? But like, how do you deal with those power differentials in your own work? Be really curious to hear.
This is a great question. Thank you for it. It's such a crucial point, the question of power, because when I speak about community and sort of social collectivities that engage in the act of speculation, it's easy to sort of romanticize and forget. Like, we think of an image of solidarity and equality, and that kind of flattens questions of power. And that's not my intention. I think that of course, so by moving us away from a kind of more economistic and, let's say, deconstructing critique of finance towards one that sees it as more generative and imaginative, I'm not suggesting that we all have equal access to those speculative, imaginative resources, precisely because, as you say, those resources are linked with material resources. So, having the time to exercise your speculative imagination, the time and the space requires you to have the material conditions of security, to exercise that, right? And so the struggles for imagination that I try to capture in the book are materially conditioned, and but my point is that there is a lot we can gain from looking at political spaces where this work, this logic, or rather, I don't want to use the term logic, this imagination of finance is being experimented with. And the point here is that I don't really believe that those spaces are to be found in retail markets, like in retail trading markets. So I don't really see GameStop as a big hope for our incoming utopia and techno bros saving the world. That's not really. If only enough of us do the right bet, then socialists kind of paradise would ensue. My point is that it's rather through the cultivation of spaces for the exercise of this endorsement of indeterminacy, this collective endorsement of indeterminacy. I think there is a lot to gain from that. And I actually, in the book, look at examples that are completely different to financial spaces. I look at so I mentioned the TikTok saboteurs, but that's the more extreme example. But I'm thinking of things like normal political, like traditional political behavior. So how people respond to binaries set to them by referenda. I talk about the Greek referendum on the terms of austerity in 2015, whereby yes means we know what it means, more austerity, but we know the terms of it, sacrifice, but a determinate image, and no means chaos. And people vote for chaos. I mean, there's something in that speculative act, which is certainly collective, and it's shaped on the ground, that I think is profoundly generative and important to stay with, rather than reject as a political act that lacks a determinate image of that future that is seeking, which is a critique on the left very often, right? But maybe I'll stop here. Yeah.
Thank you. I will have a lot of things to say. I'm just going to manage 4 very briefly, and maybe not even 4, depending on how it is. First thing, thank you so much for writing this book. This is the book I was waiting for a number of years. I had all kinds of intuitions, and you put it together, and it's short, and it's wonderfully written, and it's one of the most important things I've read. So first, thank you for the greatest book. Second, I don't want to blow the bubble, because I'm 200% on your side, and yet we talked a lot about futurities and all these things, and I've lived a lot of my life in the 18th century, and I have good friends of mine who lived and worked on the 17th century, and most of the things you said about the ambivalence of speculation, being denounced as parasitical, being very rationally advocated as being productive, and the gaming sort of use of speculation that they would do of the market in Chicago, and playing with speculative attitudes. Again, I can document pages and pages and pages of things happening from maybe not 1602, we're talking about 1602 earlier, but at least 1690s, 1720s, 1770s, way before the 19th century. So the question is, well, we've been playing the power of speculation and criticizing it and demolishing it, and it collapsed again and again and again, and it came back and it came back, and finance has survived in different guises, all these collapses and all these reappropriations of it. So I want to read your book in saying, well, this is one more twist or one more turn of the wheel, and each time the wheel takes us somewhere else, but each time the wheel turns around. So, and I don't see it as a criticism, because I don't see it as going against what you said, but just I wanted to think about the future, the past. And I won't do my third thing because it's too long. I just want to do the third one, which is a question to both of you, because we've been talking about speculation in the singular, as if speculation was something we could define. What is speculation? Speculation is that, and what you said about it is fantastic. In the book, at the end of the book, you talk about counter speculations, and I think the example you gave with TikTok and so forth would be counter speculations. Now, I've read something by Patricia where you talk about diagramming the commons. It's an old article also, sorry to make you back, but where you make a distinction between, I think, affirmative speculation and affirmative speculation. I don't know if you remember, because sometimes we say things and then we forget about it, but I thought it was quite interesting. And I'm wondering what happens when we don't talk just about speculation in the singular, but about different types of speculation. For instance, what is affirmative, whereas affirmative? What is counter in counter speculation? So that would be maybe my question for both of you.
Mm.
Yeah. Patricia, you can answer first, and then maybe we have Aris, and then another round of questions.
Sure. Yeah, it's like all the old hits. That's funny. I do really remember. I do remember it because those definitions or those distinctions came from a short-lived collective that was called Speculate This, that came right after the 2008 crash. That book probably came out in like 2009, something like this. I'm trying to remember exactly what the difference was, but one was basically kind of like, if I'm reading it, if I'm remembering it correctly and putting it more in lines with what I would think now, I would say the one form is like responding to speculation in a improbable sense, in the way that like you can speculate on things. Like I could make a wager, I can do my research based on a set of known, like actuary science, make a wager, and that's a form of, I think in their definition, in their parlance, it would be affirmative speculation, which is basically affirming the given, affirming a kind of logical path within what is sort of like kind of predetermined without any fundamental alteration. Whereas the other mode of speculation is far more imaginative, if you want to put that kind of quality upon it, because it requires that you exit the realm of givens, essentially. And so it's a more open form of speculation, and therefore it's kind of like less tied to, I guess it's less bound to that concept of a wager, in a sense, that is obviously associated like calculation. That's again, if I'm remembering it correctly, but I do recall the collective was called Speculate This, because I think that article is also from 2014. It's quite old as well. Sorry. It smells good. There's been new stuff.
maybe just, Patricia, did you want to talk more on this?
No, go ahead, please.
I'll be very brief on this. I'll add something that I mentioned in passing, but links to this question of the different types of speculation. And so my definition of my way of distinguishing, if you like, between speculation and counter-speculation is by way of distinguishing between different kinds of what I call closure. So we have the openness that is common in both speculation and counter-speculation. There is a quest for openness. Like you place a wager on the unknown, you look at uncertainty in the eye. But on speculation, what we see is, and I'm talking about the political realm here, is we see regressive types of closure, regressive types of security. Like I said, in order to speculate, in order to throw ourselves into uncertainty, we need the collective element. We need the connecting element, the relational. But often what we see, so for example, with regressive speculations, is they rely on the symbolic insurance of something like nationalism, on the reinstatement, or as Patricia was saying, the kind of established kind of notions of modernity and our patriarchal society. Like these are the forms of collectivity that form this insurance that one needs in order to speculate. So a counter-speculation is still throwing oneself into the unknown. However, it entails building progressive alliances. It entails collectivizing uncertainty through shared modes of responsibility, progressive solidarity, and so on. And these are forms that I'm very interested in, and I mentioned in some of the examples in the book, but this is the challenge for what we call left or progressive politics, I think. How to keep both sides of the coin of speculation in mind, both the openness to the unknown and the closure in terms of the security, progressive forms of security and real insurance for folks that are faced with uncertainty.
Mm.
Yeah. Do we have questions in the room? Because I have two questions actually, but later we can have other questions. One for Patricia and one for Aris. And the first one comes to Patricia. And first, thank you. Actually, I did not know at all the talks about defuturity and the defuturity thesis, and I discovered that with your talk, and that's fascinating also how it interacts with all the views on Mark Fisher, the end of the future, etc. And I had a question on the concept you described at the end, homo narens. And I was wondering, because I saw this graph that you did. Maybe I did not understand everything, but it actually reminded me of Eli Ayash's talk. Eli Ayash is not here anymore, but Eli Ayash's talk on the fact that actually you have this probabilistic approach, which relates to the bias side of the graph, I think, and he disagrees with this. And on the other side of the graph, you have the logos, and that's where you have some kind of freedom, and that's what he sees positively. And here in your graph, I saw also this same opposition between, on the one side, this probabilistic approach and the deterministic approach, and that's where the future can be estimated, etc. And on the other side, logos and also narrations and some kind of freedom. And I wonder how you would relate to Eli Ayash's argument, and also more broadly, and maybe a question I could have addressed to Eli Ayash, but isn't it a very Kantian distinction, this kind of, on the one side, the deterministic side of the world and all these statistics and probabilities, and on the other side, of kind of freedom that comes from narration and this kind of processes. So I'm just wondering this, and I would like your view, Patricia, on this. And also another question to Aris on Homo speculans. And I was just wondering, to what extent is Homo speculant really distinct from the Homo economicus? And that's a question that also relates to my work. In my research, I show how actually some financial actors have an economic interest in supporting Brexit and Trump, and in creating chaos. And you say, and actually we study a bit the same kind of factors and the same kind of entanglement between far right and finance. But for me, I try to explain it in more Marxist concepts, and trying to show actually how their business model very simply pushes them to seek volatility somewhat, and because volatility means return. And so can't we grasp it under the term of the purely economic terms, and is it so I know it's I mean, yeah, that's my question. Yeah.
Okay, I'll answer very quickly because I mean, obviously that's a kind of shorthand to just kind of map out the concept, but I was using the concept of homo narans from Sylvia Wynter, as I said. The point is that the interplay between the two, it's not this strict separation. And on that point, I'm very interested, because she is not a theorist of technology nor finance, but when you think about humans as like this biological, metabiological creature, we create stuff, we interact with that stuff. It's not that we have this absolute creation of the environment, right? I mean, that's what climate change shows us. We don't, right? There's always reality bites back. But it's about the interplay. It's about the interaction between the stuff that we do, how that gets internalized, even at the chemical level of the brain, such as you have like the artifactual mind thesis, which is essentially like a modern brain is a different composition than a brain of a different epoch, So there is this strong interplay between the two that is, I think, a much more fruitful way to think about our engagements with technology, and also the sets of accountabilities that we have when we put it in the world. And I think like one figure that just comes to mind immediately to maybe help you, who wrote like this kind of infamous essay, Langdon Winner, like, do artifacts have politics? Oh God, it's maybe like 2 decades ago already now, but he basically just kind of like really quickly cut down any picture of like the purely deterministic view or the purely indeterministic view. Why? Because if you have a purely deterministic view of technology, then society doesn't matter at all. It's nothing. Your users are like insignificant. And inversely, if you have a view of technology that is purely socially like determined by political economy, well, then the operations of the machines don't matter at all. And obviously, we're speaking in a French context. I think Simondon is already a figure that is like, before Langdon Winner kind of outlining this types of interaction. So I think that's important, because when we are talking about finance, we're talking about engagements with some sort of technology, right? Like all of those cognitive or community level interactions or analysis that we heard from Aris is impossible without interfaces, without infrastructure, without all that stuff that enables those types of interactions and engagements to happen, right? So it's important to acknowledge that in the kind of ensemble. Yeah, so I think that's how I would answer that question. And unfortunately, I was only there at the tail end for Ilyash's presentation, so I don't feel like I have enough of a kind of picture of how he was coping with this kind of figure of the improbable. But I know I was using it more in the sense of Bernard Stiegler when he was talking about the way a little bit. I mean, you were sort of countering that, Aris, which is interesting because it was a way of, following to that trap of suggesting that, that the sort of the algorithmatization or the calculability of our lives is increasingly like producing these very deterministic habitual patterns, which your work kind of unsettles that narrative, even though at a certain level it's true, it's happening a bit, but it's not purely that. But he had a really powerful expression, I thought, which was basically that mode of approaching futurity, or that mode of trying to insert determinism in that way, was a way of eliminating diversity, and like it's eliminating the array of possibility, essentially. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, and maybe that's what is also ties into your notion of the counter communities in sense of this progressivist thing, and not the regressivist, like, oh, we're scared, it's uncertain, let's speculate on an 18th century fantasy, right? That never happened. But like that's where I think this figure of the improbable of also kind of it is important to keep active, or to keep our sensibility open to certain possibilities that may be there and we are insensitive to, given the fact that we are habit-driven creatures.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with this, and also I have to confess I'm very late. I come very late to discovering Sylvia Wynter, and I think her work is so important. And yeah, there was recently a fantastic conference series actually of events in Berlin at the HKW, inspired by her work. But it's something about that you mentioned, Patricia, that, and I think my current work, my new book I'm working on, might be even more closer to the kind of questions that you're looking at. You were talking about the question of linking speculation to world making, the question of cosmologies. You mentioned some work, scientific cosmology there. There's something about, and that's in response to your question, Theo, about the distinction between kind of the deterministic Homo economicus and the more imaginative Homo speculans. And it's not a binary, but what I'm trying to say is that I guess I try to make that point with astrology. Astrology and finance or even the manipulation of data with intention to kind of concretely forecast and predict has it's a form of it's not disconnected from forms of mystical foreknowledge. There is these worlds are the boundary between these worlds is much more blurred. There is a fantastic book by a big data scientist called Alexander Boxer, who it's all about the history of astrology in parallel to the history of statistics and data science. And he, as a data scientist, makes the argument that actually data science has an astrological dimension, right? And finance has this history of chartism and methods of deciphering the codes and signals that are, they have an inherent mysticism. So where I'm going with this is that the boundary between these worlds of deterministic kind of scientific predetermination and other forms of mystical foreknowledge is much more blurred. And so maybe the last thing about the Homo speculans, yes, I think we're probably going to need another few hours to debate the Marxist kind of structural economic interests-based approach, or it's more what do you prioritize? I would say. I think our approaches are possibly complementary rather than contradicting. My point is not to discount material economic interests in shaping political outcomes and behaviors, but rather to emphasize the role of the more imaginative and speculative sort of motivations that are at play as well. And I think those are particularly important to bring into our analysis at a moment of such high uncertainty, where defining an interest is a much more nebulous enterprise.
Yeah, no, thank you. And do we have a last question or not? No? All right, so thank you very much, then. And thank you to everyone. Thank you to you, Aris. Thank you to you, Patricia. And hope to see you another time. And thank you to all those who are here online on YouTube. I don't know how many people are here, but goodbye to you. So thank you, Patricia. Goodbye. Bye.
Merci. Bonne soirée. Ciao, ciao.